When I was studying at university, I was taught to do a pH test every time I took on a new garden to understand the conditions of the soil. But very few people know what to do with a pH test. And for me, as a landscape designer and gardener of 17 years of experience, I never do pH tests anymore because they tell me very little. Whereas what's growing in the landscape and the behaviour of plants tells me much more. Plants have behaviour and personality, much like humans. And when we learn to read this as gardeners, it can completely change how we interact with the land. Plants really aren't so different to humans. They have their own personalities, behaviour, and they're shaped by their environment, completely changing how they interact with each other and how they behave in their communities. The more we get to know plants, we can read their personal behaviours, how they interact with each other, and how their environment completely changes this behaviour. When I identify a plant from a distance, people often ask me, how can I recognise it? And I would say it's kind of similar. When you learn a plant and you get to know them, it's like seeing someone you know from a distance. If you saw your brother or good friend from a distance, you would just know them from the way they move, from their certain characteristics. And it's very similar with plants, as we learn their personalities and their characteristics so that we can identify them even from a distance when perhaps it's not so clear how. Plants are shaped by their environment, much like humans are. One plant growing in very challenging conditions could look very different to a plant growing in conditions where it has plenty of light, moisture and fertility. This changes how plants interact with each other, their behaviour, whether they push other plants out the way and become quite dominant, or whether they grow quite delicately and grow in community with others. I love this idea of plant sociability. Some plants being more sociable than others, much like humans, in that some humans are very sociable, some are more introvert and not so sociable. And it's very similar in the plant kingdom, in that some plants, like stinging nettle, are quite dominant, and in the right conditions they can push other plants out the way. And then if we look at fennel, in very dry, low fertility conditions, fennel grows quite delicate and tall with quite airy leaves, and that allows you to grow plants underneath it. Whereas when we go back to the stinging nettle creates dense clumps. In some cases, it could be considered as not very sociable, meaning that if you were to grow a delicate wildflower next to it, the nettle would completely push it out of the way. And it's very helpful to understand this plant sociability when we're creating gardens and we want to create long-term sustainable plantings. Hey, Truffle! Hey! What are you up to? Come find me. Just doing some filming, Truffle. You joining me? Look over there, we have a big clump of nettle. Let's go and have a look. Look how dense it is. This is really not giving any opportunity for other plants to grow around it. But this is the behaviour of nettle in quite fertile soil, because you can see it's at the edge of the field, below this tree where it's dropping its leaves. The wall is capturing nutrients as it blows in the wind, the debris, and then breaks down here. So the nettle is responding to the environment, but this would be completely different on a very low fertility soil. Nettles are a good indicator of soil fertility. when you see them growing like this in these dense clumps, generally that's going to be where there's high fertility in the soil that the nettles are quickly using up, mining them. And that's why for us gardeners, harvesting those nettles and turning them into plant food, they're very good. Here growing in this meadow we've got loads of fennel. Here you go, look at the leaves of fennel. See how they are quite fern-like and feathery. They don't cast deep shade, and that's why fennel can be quite a sociable plant in plantings, where it grows up tall, and because of the leaf structure allowing light to shine through to the lower layers or the ground layer, it means that we can grow plants underneath it. But that's the thing. Fennel in very fertile conditions can change its behaviour, and it can become quite dominant, pushing other plants out the way. And that's where this idea of plant sociability is great, but we also need to understand other factors in plant behaviour and how that changes depending on the environment. It's good to leave these stalks standing over winter, because insects burrow into their hollow stalks and use it as habitat and a place to live over the winter months. And that's another way humans and plants aren't so different, because we're shaped by our environment. We completely change depending on how the environment is around us. And it's the same for plants. If plants are growing in very difficult conditions with lack of moisture, fertility, and being battered by the wind, their behaviour is completely different to those plants growing in fertile, water retentive, sunny conditions where they're sheltered. They become much more lush and tender, and their growth is rapid. Whereas in those difficult conditions, the plants can become quite short, stocky, tough, slow growing, and resistant towards the stress. When I was at university studying ethnobotany at the Eden Project, I did a study on plants as indicator species. What can plants tell us about the soil and the environment just by looking at what's growing there? What I found is when we look at what plants are growing where and their behaviour, it's one of the most accurate ways to understand the land and the soil. Look at this here. In the middle of this field, we have a large clump of plants that are much more vigorous than the plants surrounding it. To me, I would look at this and say there's a change in the conditions. Likely here, there's much higher fertility. Maybe it was an old compost heap or burn pile, which means that there's much more nutrients deposited in the soil, which has changed the behaviour of these plants. Look, you can clearly see how much more vigorous the plants are here compared to over there. So thistle shows up when the soil needs something to break it open, so that water can filtrate down. It has more space and air for microbes to break down organic matter and create these bonds with plants. And that's where thistle and many of the plants we class as weeds are actually a remediator of damage we or other beings might have caused the soil. Thistle is just a response to the conditions, and that's where if we're struggling with too much thistle in our garden or landscape and we want to control it, rather than seeing it as a problem, we can see it as a signal about the land, and we can respond to this. So if thistle's coming in to break up soil compaction, it's got a role to play, and its role is to improve soil conditions so that the soil can move up through successional stages to woodland. But first it goes to shrubland communities, and then pioneer trees and climax trees. So if we understand that thistle is a response to the soil conditions, if we help change those conditions, if we open up compaction, we stop the disturbance and stop damaging the soil structure, generally thistle will move out of the planting. It will move away from those conditions because it's changed. And thistle really has a role to play to improve the soil. We can see that so many of the plants here are just a response to disturbed ground where the soil isn't doing so well, it's compacted. And I know that this field has been mown with a tractor on a regular basis, and the ground has been compacted and hasn't been allowed to breathe. So if we look at the plants growing here, we have thistle, and that's what we just discussed. We have dandelion with its deep taproot to break up soil compaction and help fix sugars into the soil, which are then shared with the microbes that further break up the soil. What are you doing, Truffle? Come here. Come on. You looking at the plants as well? You observing the landscape? Curious little dog. Come here. Come here. Come on. Ew. All plants have a role to play in the landscape. Much like a human village, where we need people taking up different roles for the village to thrive. We need a baker, a carpenter, a gardener. And in the landscape, it's very similar with plants and their roles they play. Many of our so-called weeds in the garden are pioneers. They come in and they get established on disturbed ground. They improve the soil structure, they build soil, and they create the conditions necessary for longer lived plants, shrubs and trees to grow and thrive. Plants have different strategies of survival. Some plants are competitors, meaning that their adaptive strategy is to compete with others, to grow rapidly and very lush, and to push other plants out the way. But in this, they build organic matter rapidly. Then you have stress-tolerators, plants that are adapted to grow in the most stressful conditions. When we understand these two conditions and the plants that have evolved to grow there, it can completely change how we interact with the land and our gardens. I've found that understanding the behaviour of plants has helped me in not taking it so personally when things don't go to plan in the garden, and understanding that it just means that the landscape wants to express itself in a different way through what grows there. The amazing thing about gardening is I can try to grow something in my garden, and if it fails to grow, I could try to grow it 20 metres away, or my neighbour could try to grow it and it could grow and thrive. And that's why it's important not to take it personally when plants don't manage to grow when we want them to, and to understand that perhaps we need to try growing it somewhere else, try growing something different, and learn from our mistakes and successes. We can come up with the most thoughtful, beautiful design for our garden, but ultimately plants have personalities and behaviours of their own. And that's where I believe the best gardens are those that have evolved over time, and the gardener has sensitively edited the land, but listened to where the plants want to be. When we understand plant behaviour, it completely changes how we interact with the land. We can learn to listen to what the plants and the landscapes are saying, and this changes our connection to the land. And I believe that if we're taught this in schools, it would change culture.